6 o'clock in the evening, December 17, 1944. A farmhouse outside the Belgian village of Rocherath, windows blacked out, floor gone to mud under boots that hadn't been dry in 3 days. By lamplight, Lieutenant Colonel William Dawes McKinley leaned over a map and told his company commanders the same thing he'd already told them twice that afternoon. Hold the crossroads. Hold it at a scatter of 2 farm buildings called Lostell, a mile northeast of the village, astride the only road the Germans needed. Hold it at all costs. He was not yet 30. He'd grown up on army posts from Georgia to the Panama Canal Zone, the son of a general, and he carried a family name that had already been written into American history once before, in a way none of the men in that room knew yet. Outside, the night had gone quiet in the specific way a front line goes quiet just before something arrives. No artillery, no small arms fire. Just cold, an engine somewhere to the east that never seemed to get closer or farther away. Among the scraps of 2 battalions his division commander had scraped together to plug this gap, McKinley had one asset that would matter more than anyone in that farmhouse yet understood. A single section of heavy machine guns, water-cooled, belt-fed, older in basic design than most of the men who'd be firing them. Within 36 hours, that section and 7 others like it, dug into a ridge nobody back home had ever heard of, would help stop the spearhead of an entire German army. And within about 2 years, German veterans asked to name the machine guns that had frightened them most in 6 years of war would name this one specifically. Not the fastest gun America built, not the newest, not even by most tallies the deadliest. The one that would not stop firing. To understand why that mattered, you first have to understand what the American soldier was afraid of. By the winter of 1944, the sound alone could do it. A tearing, ripping burst, faster than the ear could separate into individual shots, closer to fabric ripping than to gunfire. That was the MG-42, the machine gun the Wehrmacht had put at the center of its infantry squad, and German troops had already given it a nickname that left nothing to interpretation. Notchensedge. Bone saw. American soldiers, hearing it for the first time, called it Hitler's buzz saw, and the fear it produced was not a figure of speech. It fired somewhere north of 1,000 rounds a minute, more than twice the rate of anything the U.S. Army carried into the hedgerows or the Ardennes, and the psychological effect on green replacements was severe enough that the War Department commissioned a training film specifically to counter it, to convince frightened riflemen, before they ever heard the real thing, that the sound was worse than the result. German infantry doctrine had been rebuilt almost entirely around this weapon. The squad did not exist to protect its riflemen. The riflemen existed to protect, feed, and reposition the gun. Where other armies treated the machine gun as one tool among several, the German army had made it the center of gravity for the entire squad, and by every measure that mattered in the first years of the war, that decision had paid off. This was not a weak enemy the Americans needed to convince themselves was dangerous. This was, gun for gun, the most feared automatic weapon fielded by any infantry in Europe, carried by an army that had spent 5 years teaching the rest of the continent to fear it. America had not always taken the machine gun seriously enough to build a rival. When the United States declared war on Germany in April of 1917, its entire arsenal of modern machine guns numbered barely more than 1,000 weapons, most of them already obsolete, forcing the American Expeditionary Force into France dependent on French and British guns it hadn't designed and didn't fully control the supply of. A new American design existed on paper, a water-cooled gun from the country's most prolific firearms inventor, but wartime production is not the same thing as wartime delivery, and the tooling, the subcontractors, and the retooled factories needed months the front did not have. By the time crates of the new gun, stamped model of 1917, started reaching French ports in real numbers, the war had 10 weeks left in it. Barely 1,200 of them saw combat at all. One battalion didn't trade its French guns for the new American ones until 3 days after the armistice was already signed. Where the gun did reach the line in time, in the last hard fighting east of the Meuse, in the final weeks of the Argonne, it performed. But arriving late to your own war is not a foundation you can call a victory, and the U.S. Army knew it. Worse, the gun that had finally arrived carried a real, measurable disadvantage against the British and French guns beside it. Firing a flat-based American cartridge with roughly a third less reach than its allies' ammunition, it was outranged in exactly the kind of long, indirect fire that gunnery officers on both sides were starting to realize might be the machine gun's real future. Matching Germany gun for gun, rate of fire for rate of fire, was never going to work. America's machine gun had shown up outgunned, and 11 weeks too late. Something else was going to have to change. That something turned out to be knowable, and it wasn't a secret pulled from a captured enemy weapon. It was a limitation built into the German system itself, sitting in plain sight the whole time, waiting for someone to take it seriously. A rifle squad built around one air-cooled gun has a metabolism. It burns through barrels, which need changing every few hundred rounds under sustained fire. It burns through ammunition at a rate no infantry column can carry on its own back for long. And it depends completely on that one gun and its 2- or 3-man crew staying alive, because unlike an army that treats the machine gun as support for the riflemen, an army that treats the riflemen as support for the machine gun has built itself a squad with exactly one vital organ. The German gun had been engineered to win an engagement in the first violent minutes of contact, and it usually did. Nobody had engineered it, or the doctrine wrapped around it, to still be firing an hour later, in the same position, without ever needing to stop. 26 years before that farmhouse in Rocherath, in a workshop in Ogden, Utah, a 50-something inventor named John Moses Browning had already solved the problem, without knowing there was a Belgian crossroads in his future that would need it. Browning was already the most consequential gun designer in American history by the time the machine gun took his full attention. His lever-action rifles had defined the Winchester catalog. His pistol design would arm the U.S. military for most of the 20th century. And in 1900, he patented a Reich-operated automatic gun built on principles nobody else in the industry was using. Every serious machine gun of the era, German, British, Russian, traced its mechanism back to Hiram Maxim's toggle lock design from the 1880s. Browning ignored it completely, building instead around a sliding breech block driven straight back by recoil, a mechanism that was simpler to manufacture, easier to maintain in the field, and crucially, less prone to the kind of finicky failure that plagued Maxim-pattern guns under sustained fire. He shelved the idea for a decade because Maxim already owned the market and Browning saw no opening. The opening arrived with American entry into the First World War, and when it did, Browning didn't just deliver a gun. He staged a demonstration in early 1918 built to erase any doubt the brass still carried. One gun fired tens of thousands of rounds with only minor stoppages. A second was simply left running, continuously, for 48 minutes and 12 seconds without a single interruption. A length of sustained automatic fire that no one in that room had ever watched a machine gun produce. At just 47 pounds for the gun itself, it was lighter than the German Army's own water-cooled Maxim derivative by nearly 90 pounds, and more reliable besides. There was already, even then, one detail built in for the men who'd eventually crawl behind it in the dark. A rubber hose that carried the steam boiling off the water jacket back into a condensing can instead of venting it into the night air, because a visible plume of steam over a machine gun position was as good as a signal flare to anyone hunting that position with a mortar. The gun that reached the Meuse front in the final weeks of 1918 was not yet the finished weapon. It took the U.S. Army most of 2 decades to finish it. In 1926, ordnance officers replaced the original flat-based bullet with a new streamlined, boat-tailed round, extending the machine gun's effective range past 3 miles and erasing the disadvantage that had embarrassed it beside British and French guns in the war's final weeks. Then, starting in 1936, Rock Island Arsenal began pulling old model of 1917s out of storage and rebuilding them almost from the ground up, reinforced receivers, a new sighting system, an improved tripod with elevation and traverse built into a single unit, and sent them back into service under a new designation, the M1917A1. It weighed over 100 pounds, fully rigged with tripod, water, and ammunition. It required a dedicated squad just to carry its pieces. Men handling the barrel jacket after firing wore asbestos mittens, because the water inside, even sealed, could scald skin through the metal. None of that mattered to the men who ended up trusting their lives to it. What mattered was what a heavy weapons company sergeant from the 8th Infantry Division said about his 2 years behind one, decades later, to his own son. That with water in the jacket and ammunition on hand, you could fire it for a week. Firing it for a week was the whole point, and it led to a second discovery, one the U.S. Army had actually started working out between the wars, and then very nearly forgot it owned. Ask most people today to name the indirect fire weapons in a World War II infantry battalion, and they'll say mortars. And they'd be right. As far as it goes, 60mm tubes in the rifle companies, 81s in the heavy weapons company. What almost nobody guesses is the third system, sitting in the same heavy weapons company as the mortars. 8 water-cooled machine guns, each one capable of doing something that sounds, on its face, like a contradiction. Machine guns are supposed to be direct-fire weapons. Point the muzzle at the man you want to hit. Mounted on the M1917A1's tripod with elevation and traverse locked to firing data instead of a set of eyes on the target, it could do the opposite. Gunners used aiming stakes and range cards, the same basic tools an artillery battery used, to lay a beaten zone of fire onto ground they could not see at all, the far side of a ridge, a road junction a mile off, a patch of forest where a column was expected to move after dark, and hold that fire accurately for as long as the mission required, because the gun didn't care how long the mission required. A rifle squad advancing into contact could be covered by fire passing safely over their own heads. A road the enemy needed at 3 in the morning could be denied without a single American soldier able to see it happen. It turned a weapon everyone assumed was short-range and reactive into something closer to a fixed, silent piece of artillery that never had to sleep. The underlying idea was almost embarrassingly simple once somebody said it out loud. A machine gun that never has to see its target is a machine gun the enemy can never find and never silence. That was the answer to the German buzz saw, and the answer sat inside a trap the German system could not climb out of. Because the squad had been built around one gun, the loss of that gun, to counterfire, to a jam, to a crew casualty, didn't just weaken a German position, it gutted it. And by late 1944, the men who could replace a dead gunner with the same skill were getting harder to find with every month that passed. Because the gun ran hot and hungry, Sustaining that rate of fire for any length of time burned through barrels and ammunition at a pace. An increasingly strangled German logistics system, hammered from the air on every road and rail line behind the front, could not consistently feed. High command in Berlin had built its infantry doctrine around speed and shock, around winning the first 5 minutes, and that doctrine had no real answer for an opponent who had spent 20 years quietly building a weapon, and the training pipeline behind it, engineered for the opposite virtue entirely: endurance. The German gun was faster. The American gun was going to still be there in an hour. Back in that Rocherath farmhouse, none of the men taking McKinley's orders needed the historical version of that argument. They needed the 8 guns his division commander, Major General Walter M. Robertson, had scraped together and rushed to the crossroads once he understood how badly the line east of the Twin Villages was cracking. McKinley's own family name deserves its full weight here, because it wasn't decoration. He was the grandnephew of President William McKinley, assassinated in 1901, a name that had already been carved into American memory once by a bullet, in a country at peace, and now belonged to a young officer carrying it into a country at war. He'd graduated West Point in 1937, commissioned an infantry lieutenant, and risen to lieutenant colonel and a battalion command still short of his 30th birthday, young enough that his own executive officer, Major William Hancock, would later describe an ordinary, almost domestic moment from the night before the fighting started, stepping outside the command post after dark, in a rare stretch of quiet, just to look at the sky, the way a man does out of habit rather than duty, and noticing an odd, glowing cloud bank low on the southern horizon that had nothing to do with weather at all. That was the artillery of an offensive nobody at battalion level had been told was coming. Robertson's decision to strip a rifle company and a machine gun section away from a different battalion entirely and throw them into McKinley's sector, on instinct, hours before anyone had a full picture of what was hitting the line, is the kind of unglamorous, correct call that never gets a statue. It is also very close to the whole reason the crossroads held. What happened at Lostell over the next 18 hours was not tidy. German infantry and armor from the 12th SS Panzer Division and the 277th Volksgrenadier Division came at the crossroads through the dark and into the next morning, and McKinley's patchwork force, survivors of 2 rifle companies, an anti-tank platoon, and that section of water-cooled guns from Company M, held a farmhouse and a scrap of pasture against them for the better part of a day. Captain Garvey's company was overrun outright. Watching from inside the farmhouse as his men were taken prisoner, he held on with a handful of wounded until a German tank parked outside and put its main gun on the front door, at which point he surrendered rather than get the rest of them killed for nothing. McKinley, along with 2 of his remaining company commanders, was among the very last men out, receiving permission to pull back around 10 the next morning, and executing the withdrawal near noon under cover of American tanks that came roving up the Rocherath road at exactly the right moment. The 18 hours it cost the Germans to clear that single crossroads were 18 hours the rest of the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions used to fall back onto high ground a few miles west, a ridge line the Americans had already spent weeks quietly fortifying, without knowing they'd need it this badly, this soon. None of what you've just heard comes from the version of this battle that gets repeated because it's been repeated before. It comes out of division after-action reports, a battalion executive officer's own written account of that week, and casualty rosters that still, 80 years on, don't fully agree with each other about exact numbers. There's a common shorthand online that the Battle of the Bulge was decided at Bastogne and everything north of it was a sideshow. It wasn't. If a channel doing the unglamorous work of checking that kind of shorthand against the paperwork is worth something to you, the like button doesn't cost you anything, and it tells us to keep digging. On the other side of that crossroads, the men running Kampfgruppe paper, the armored spearhead of the entire 1st SS Panzer Division, nearly 5,000 men and 600 vehicles tasked with reaching the Meuse River on a strict fuel and timetable budget, were discovering that their own plan had started coming apart before they'd fired a shot in anger. Their intended route had been mined and blocked. A bridge they needed had been destroyed weeks earlier and never repaired. An alternate crossing turned out too weak to bear the weight of their tanks. Rerouted, delayed, forced south through Hansfeld and Boulingen to grab fuel wherever they could find it. Paper's column was already behind a schedule measured in hours, not days, when a reconnaissance element probing toward the village of Würzfeld ran straight into a defense nobody had planned or trained. Cooks, clerks, drivers, an artillery battery, and 5 tank destroyers, thrown together because they happened to be standing in the way. That improvised scratch force knocked out 4 German tanks and a half-track before the rest pulled back. Within days, the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, one of the best-equipped formations Germany still had in the West, would be pulled out of the fight for the twin villages entirely and rerouted on a long, humiliating detour just to get back onto a usable road heading west. An offensive built entirely around speed was losing its hours, one crossroads, one blocked bridge, one improvised roadblock at a time, and every hour it lost was an hour the Americans used to dig in on the high ground behind them. That high ground was Elsenborn Ridge, and the fight for the twin villages that fed into it, spread across 3 brutal days, produced 5 separate Medal of Honor actions. Among them, Private First Class William Soderman, who used a bazooka near Rocherath to knock out 3 German tanks before he was wounded covering his platoon's withdrawal. By the night of December 19th, the survivors of Rocherath had pulled back in reasonably good order onto a position that, unlike Lostell, the Americans had actually had time to prepare dug-in machine gun positions with interlocking fields of fire, artillery pre-registered on every likely approach, foxholes roofed over with felled timber against the tree bursts everyone knew were coming. The 8 guns that had bought time at one crossroads now had 70-odd cousins spread the length of a division front, sighted exactly where doctrine said a water-cooled gun belonged, dug in, mutually supporting, and built to still be firing long after a faster gun would have gone silent. Subscribe now if you want to be here for the part of this war that doesn't make the highlight reel. Because what happened on that frozen ridge in the days after Christmas week is the reason a defeated Panzer army would later name this specific gun, out of everything America built, as the one it could never quite outrun. The temperature along that stretch of the Ardennes front, through the final weeks of December and into January, averaged barely above freezing in the daytime and well below it at night. Cold enough that Greece seized in bolt actions. Cold enough that the U.S. Army had recently added a wholly unglamorous new item to the M1917A1's accessory list. Antifreeze mixed into the water jacket in a specified ratio, because a barrel jacket frozen solid was a machine gun turned instantly into 100 pounds of dead steel. Crews who trained on the gun in Georgia summers were now nursing it through Belgian winter nights with a chemistry problem nobody had briefed them on 18 months earlier. And through that cold, wave after wave of German infantry and armor came at Elsenborn Ridge and the villages anchoring it. And wave after wave broke against a combination of American artillery, pre-registered and merciless, and machine gun fire, that did not confine itself to what a gunner could see down his own sights. Some of it was direct fire, ordinary and lethal, mowing down infantry in the open at close range. Some of it was the other kind, indirect, plunging, aimed by stakes and range cards at a reverse slope or a suspected assembly area, an American gunner never laid eyes on, arriving out of the dark on men who had no muzzle flash to shoot back at, no position to overrun, nothing to do but wait it out or die in it. Major General Walter Lauer, commanding the 99th Division through this fight, would later sum up the German command's failure in a single flat sentence. The enemy held the key to success, but did not realize it. They had the numbers in places and the armor, and still they broke. 12th SS Panzer, one of Hitler's most trusted formations, spent itself against that ridge and never fully recovered. The road to the Meuse that Kampfgruppe paper had been ordered to reach on a rigid schedule was never opened at all. Within days his column, cut off from fuel and reinforcement, would abandon its vehicles and walk out through the lines on foot. Elsenborn Ridge is not the battle most people picture when they hear the words Battle of the Bulge. Bastogne owns that image. The surrounded paratroopers, the single-word reply to a surrender demand. But on the northern shoulder of that same offensive, it was this ridge, and the guns dug into it, that denied an entire panzer army the ground it needed and never got back. What lingered longest in German accounts written after the war wasn't the volume of fire. It was the unpredictability of it, the sense that any quiet field could open up without warning, from a gun its target never even located, at 3 in the morning, for as long as the mission required. By the time those accounts were written, the men giving them weren't describing American firepower in the abstract anymore. They were naming a specific machine gun. By the last days of December, the German offensive on the northern shoulder had gone from behind schedule to finished. The 6th Panzer Army's best divisions had been fed into Elsenborn Ridge and the villages in front of it, and they had not moved it. There wasn't a technological answer waiting in a German arsenal for what they'd run into, no rival system that let an air-cooled gun sustain fire the way a water jacket could. No logistics network left, by that point in the war, capable of matching American ammunition production even if there had been. The closest thing to a German countermeasure was caution, orders filtering down to avoid movement near American lines in daylight, to route columns around ground the Americans had been sitting on for more than a few days, to treat quiet fields with a wariness that had nothing to do with what could actually be seen in them. That is not the behavior of an army that has found an answer. It is the behavior of an army that has stopped trying to find one. Lieutenant Colonel McKinley survived Lostell, and he survived the rest of the war with his battalion, decorated with the Silver Star for gallantry in Normandy that June, and before the fighting in Europe ended, a bronze oak leaf cluster in place of a second award of the same medal for the months of combat that followed, Lostell among them. The name that had once belonged to an assassinated president now belonged, this time, to a man who came home. He would go on to be remembered, decades later, in a eulogy written by his own military academy. A long life, quietly lived, that the young officer in that blacked-out farmhouse had no guarantee of on the night this story opened. On the other side of the line, the commander whose spearhead had been blunted at Würzfeld and diverted through Hansfeld, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper, survived the war as well, was tried and convicted after it in connection with atrocities committed by troops under his command during the same offensive, served roughly a decade in prison, and was eventually released. He spent his later years living quietly in rural France under his own name. In 1976, more than 30 years after the Ardennes, his house was burned in the night by attackers who were never identified and never caught. His body was found in the ruins, along with a weapon, suggesting he had tried to fight back against whoever came for him in the dark. Nobody was ever charged. It is difficult, knowing that, not to notice the shape of the irony. A man who had spent a war trying to outrun fire he could not locate and could not stop, dying 3 decades later, exactly that way. None of this was won by famous names alone, and it's worth saying plainly. For every McKinley or Soderman whose name made it into a citation, there were dozens of men in every battalion whose entire war was carrying water cans, ammunition boxes, and spare barrels through mud and snow so that a gun neither the papers nor the newsreels bothered to film could keep running. 8 guns to a battalion meant something like 70 or more spread across a single infantry division's frontage by the time the fighting reached Elsenborn. A density most people, even people who think they know this war well, have never had reason to picture. The famous names were the visible edge of a system built to put a working, sustained fire machine gun within reach of nearly every yard of American line the Germans might try to cross. That system, not any one crew or any one crossroads, is what actually broke against the 6th Panzer Army in December of 1944. Laid out plainly in order. 1900, Browning files the original patent. 1918, the gun reaches the Meuse front in the war's final 10 weeks. 1926, a new streamlined cartridge fixes its range disadvantage for good. 1936, Rock Island Arsenal rebuilds it into the M1917A1. December 17th and 18th, 1944, the stand at the Lostell crossroads. The days that follow, the defense of Elsenborn Ridge itself. And within a few years of the war's end, its slow replacement in American service by lighter, newer designs that could never quite match what the water-cooled gun had actually been built to do. Set against the whole of that timeline, 4 things explain the reversal, and none of them work without the other 3. First, the machine itself, a water-cooled design capable of sustained fire no German ground gun could match, full stop, for as long as water and ammunition held out. Second, the doctrine wrapped around it, indirect, artillery-style harassing fire that let a machine gun hit ground its own crew never saw, denying the enemy movement and rest even in total darkness. Third, the reach. 8 guns to a battalion, tens of thousands built, spread so densely across the line that killing one crew barely dented the system feeding fire into any given sector. And fourth, standing behind all 3, the industrial base that kept the belts full and the barrels replaced through a winter in which Germany's equivalent capacity was being bombed, starved of fuel, and slowly ground down to nothing. Set against that fourth factor, the arithmetic of the fighting around the twin villages alone is brutal by any standard. Cautious estimates, the exact figures still disputed today, put American losses in that narrow 3-day fight at somewhere close to 1,200 killed and missing, and several hundred more wounded. A heavy bill, paid to inflict even heavier, largely unrecoverable losses on some of the best-equipped divisions the German army had left in the West. Here is the part the popular version of this story usually leaves out. If you ask most people today to name the American machine gun the Germans feared, they'll say the .50 caliber, the M2, a heavier, later weapon immortalized a few weeks after Lostell by a young lieutenant named Audie Murphy, who climbed onto a burning tank destroyer and held off a company of German infantry with its .50 caliber gun until he ran it dry. That story is true, and it deserves its fame. But the M2 was comparatively rare at the infantry level in December of 1944, and the water-cooled .30 caliber gun this film has been following was not rare at all. It was standard equipment in every single heavy weapons company in the Army, the workhorse rather than the headline. It's also worth saying, without hedging, that no machine gun of any caliber inflicted the majority of German casualties in this battle. Artillery did that, as it did in nearly every major engagement of the war, and any honest accounting has to put the largest share of credit for stopping the 6th Panzer Army on the guns of the field artillery battalions dug in behind the ridge. What the machine gun did, and did as well as anything else the army owned, was force the enemy to pay in blood and time for every yard, keep firing long after a faster weapon would have gone silent, and buy the hours that let the rest of the system do its work. The M1917A1 kept fighting long after most people assumed it should have retired. It went to Korea. Small numbers of them went to Vietnam in the war's early years, in the hands of American advisors and South Vietnamese units, considered heavy and old-fashioned even then and used anyway, because reliable was still reliable. By the late 1950s, the Army had already replaced it as standard issue with a lighter, air-cooled gun called the M60, a weapon whose feed mechanism, in one of the stranger footnotes in American ordnance history, borrowed directly from the very German MG42 lineage that had once been called a bone saw across the Ardennes. The gun that finally retired the water-cooled Browning owed part of its own insides to the weapon the Browning had been built to outlast. Elsenborn Ridge itself is still there, a stretch of quiet Belgian farmland and pine forest that most visitors doing the standard bulge itinerary drive straight passed on their way to Bastogne, unaware that the northern shoulder of the same offensive was decided a few miles off the main road. The regimental motto of the men who held the Lostell crossroads was 3 words: keep up the fire. Nobody chose that motto with this particular gun in mind. By December of 1944, it might as well have been written for it. If you're still here, that probably means you're the kind of person who wants the sourced version of this story rather than the shorthand one. And that's exactly what this channel is built to keep doing. Going back to after-action reports, unit histories, and the paperwork nobody bothered to dramatize, instead of just repeating what the last video said. A subscribe with notifications on means you're here for the next one. And down in the comments, tell us this. Does anyone in your own family history have a connection to a heavy weapons company on either side of that war, the unglamorous ones, the water carriers, the ammo bearers? Because most of them were never asked, and this is as close as some of them are ever going to get to having their gun story told properly. A machine gun does not have to be the loudest in the war, or the fastest, or the newest, to be the one an enemy remembers by name decades later. Sometimes it only has to be the one that never stopped.